My name is Ione Merrick, and at 70 years old, I had never stepped foot on a cruise ship. That morning, in Charleston, I thought the wait was finally over. I had packed carefully, even bought a new linen dress that felt too extravagant for my usual librarian's pension. My straw hat sat tilted just right, and I had tucked sunscreen into my woven tote bag. A small dream, modest but mine, 1 week at sea, surrounded by my son, his wife, and my 2 grandchildren. The cruise terminal buzzed with energy. Families hurried past, children tugging at luggage, couples laughing. The smell of salt water and fried shrimp from nearby vendors drifting in the air. I let myself smile, my suitcase balanced at my feet, the straps of my sandals biting gently into my skin, as if reminding me I was still rooted to this earth, waiting to be carried away. Raphael was late, though that never surprised me, since marrying Allison. Punctuality had become a luxury. I found a seat on a wooden bench near the entrance, telling myself he'd appear soon enough. Tall frame cutting through the crowd, smile wide, kids in tow. Instead, my phone buzzed. I pulled it from my bag, expecting a quick update about parking or boarding passes. The words froze me in place, Mom. Change of plans. You're not coming on the cruise. It's just a family trip. The letters blurred as my eyes tried to make sense of them. My hand trembled so hard, I thought I might drop the phone. My throat tightened, dry, as though the humid Carolina air had turned to sand. I lifted my head instinctively. And that's when I saw them, on the deck above. Raphael stood with Allison and the children. Julia clutched a stuffed dolphin, waving it like a banner, while little Matthew leaned against the railing, pointing at the water. Allison brushed a strand of blonde hair from her face, her hand light on Raphael's shoulder. They looked exactly like the brochure's Sonny. Complete. A picture of family joy. Raphael glanced down at his phone, the glow of the screen painting his face. He never looked toward the benches. I sat motionless, my heart heavy, while the ship's horn groaned across the harbor. The sound rattled in my chest like a warning bell. I closed my bag slowly, lifted my suitcase handle, and walked away from the terminal. I knew where I was going. The drive back from the port blurred into a haze of wet streets and car horns. Charleston's charm wasted on eyes that couldn't see past their own sting. When I reached my little bungalow on Rutledge Avenue, I set my suitcase down in the hallway without even turning on the light, my body folded into the old armchair, and without meaning to. I slipped back into the years that had built this moment, brick by brick. Raphael was 6 when his father died. I was 38. Suddenly, both breadwinner and anchor, with a child who still had nightmares and woke calling for the man who would never walk through the door again. The Charleston Public Library took me on full time, but the hours were never enough to cover rent and food. I worked weekends at a diner off Meeting Street, pouring coffee until my wrists ached. There were nights I would come home so late, the only sound in the house was the slow rhythm of Raphael's breathing, and I would sit by his bed, just to remind myself why my bones hurt. Vacations were never more than afternoons at Folly Beach. I wanted to show him the world, but the world was expensive, and I was already trading sleep for school supplies. When he was a teenager, I put aside pieces of every paycheck. By the time he married Allison, I had saved enough to buy them a modest house across town. My retirement savings vanished into that down payment. But watching him carry his bride over the threshold made the sacrifice feel worth it. It should have been a foundation, a place that tied us closer. Instead, it became walls that kept me out. Invitations thinned, birthdays were short visits, holidays rotated somewhere else. My quilt, my books. The small traces of me slowly disappeared from their home. I used to tell myself love was enough, that love would circle back and recognize me. But sitting in the dark, the image of them on that ship still raw in my mind, I wondered if all those years of sleepless nights and empty pockets had added up to anything more than silence. By evening, the weight of the day had pressed me flat against my bungalow's silence. The air smelled faintly of paper and lemon oil from the shelves I'd polished the week before. I switched on the desk lamp in my small office, its yellow glow spreading over the neat rows of binders and boxes I had arranged over the years. There was one drawer I hadn't opened in months, the second one down, where I kept the documents that mattered most. I slid it open and drew out a faded blue folder, the cardboard edges soft from years of being handled. My fingers hesitated before unclasping it, as though I already knew the truth waiting inside. There it was, the deed to Raphael and Allison's house. My name printed in clean black ink, the sole owner. 10 years had passed since I walked into that lawyer's office with my life savings, signed the papers, and handed them a future. Just 2 months ago, I'd written the last check to clear the mortgage. I had tucked the receipt into this same folder with quiet pride, believing I had secured their stability forever. The silence in the room sharpened into clarity. They had a home because I gave it to them, and yet I wasn't welcome to step inside without calling ahead, wasn't invited to dinners or Sunday afternoons. My quilt was folded away, my place at the table gone. But this paper, heavy as a stone in my hand, told another story. I picked up the phone and dialed a familiar number. It rang twice before a calm voice answered. "Clara," I asked softly. "Ione," she replied, warmth threading her tone. We had met decades earlier at the library before she'd moved on to practice law. "I need you to remind me of something," I said, staring at the document. "That house I bought for Raphael, it's still mine, isn't it?" A pause, then steady confirmation. "It's in your name. Legally. You can do whatever you choose with it." The words settled over me like a tide pulling back, revealing ground I hadn't realized I still stood on. After hanging up with Clara, I sat for a long time at my desk, the deed lying open in front of me. For years, I'd told myself ownership was just paperwork, a technicality. Tonight, it felt like something else entirely, a boundary I had never dared to enforce. I opened my laptop and signed into the bank portal. For almost a decade, I had kept their lives running with quiet keystrokes, automatic payments for water, power, even the property taxes when they came due. Raphael never asked, but he never stopped me either. He'd call it Mom just being helpful. But tonight, I clicked cancel, one by one. I removed myself from their monthly rhythm. A hollow pang passed through me, like shutting down a machine I'd powered for too long. When I closed the laptop, the bungalow was silent, but it was a different silence than before. Not emptiness, not exile, something steadier, like standing at the edge of a line I had finally drawn in the sand. The next morning, I called Teresa Walker. We'd been friends since her early days as a real estate agent. Back when she used to drop by the library to research Charleston zoning laws, her voice was brisk, but kind. "Iona, it's been too long." "What can I do for you? I need to sell a house," I said, and surprised myself with how calm the words sounded. Teresa didn't ask many questions, just promised she could meet me that afternoon. I printed out the deed and tucked it into my bag. When she arrived, sharp in her navy blazer, we drove together across town. I let her walk through the rooms, clipboard in hand. While I stood by the door, every sound echoed differently now, less like family, more like inventory. On the way back, Teresa glanced at me. "We'll find buyers quickly." "Ione, Charleston's market is hot right now." I nodded, eyes fixed on the passing marshland. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was drowning in sacrifices I couldn't name. I felt the lift of air returning to my lungs. A calm clarity I'd almost forgotten was possible the next day. Teresa and I returned to the house for a formal walkthrough. She carried her clipboard, crisp and professional, her heels clicking lightly across the hardwood. I carried only the keys, though they felt heavier than any folder or bag, stepping inside. The familiar scent of lemon polish and laundry should have comforted me. Instead, it caught in my throat. The living room looked polished for appearances, but stripped of warmth. On the walls, photographs hung in neat frames, birthdays, school recitals, vacations. I moved closer and felt a jolt. In some of the older shots, I had been there standing with Julia on my lap, holding a birthday cake beside Raphael. But now, I saw the new prints. Cropped edges, angles that cut me out. I had disappeared from their history, one frame at a time. In the den, I opened the linen chest and found my quilt, the one I had stitched through the long winter after Allison's first pregnancy. Deep blues and golds, each square sewn with the care of a prayer, folded and tucked away. It had been replaced on the couch by a factory throw, the price tag still dangling from a corner seam. I walked through the hallway toward Raphael's office. My books, once shelved there, classic novels. Reference guides were gone. The shelves gleamed with empty space, as though even words I had touched no longer belonged. While I lingered, Teresa opened the desk drawers, checking for papers that might matter. She froze, eyes narrowing at a folder stamped with a law firm's name. Ione, she said softly. Pulling it out, inside was a draft document transfer of property, dated 3 months ago, unsigned, but clear in intent. They had planned to ask no, to assume I would sign everything over once the mortgage was cleared. I held the paper in my hands. The edges crinkled beneath my fingers. But my voice stayed steady. They never showed this to me. Teresa looked at me, her expression careful. It doesn't matter. It was never executed. The house is yours, without question. I slid the draft back into the folder, tucking it beneath my arm like evidence. My eyes traveled once more across the bare shelves and the cropped photographs. Love, I thought, should leave traces. Here, only absence remained. It happened faster than even Teresa predicted. 2 days after the walkthrough, she called with a tone both triumphant and cautious. Ione, I found a couple young professionals. No financing delays. They want the house in cash. By the end of the week, the papers were signed. The money, wired directly into my account, felt unreal numbers glowing on a screen where once my sacrifices had vanished. While Teresa handled the legal formalities with Clara's oversight, I focused on the part I could control, leaving nothing behind that would brand me cruel. I rented a storage unit on Meeting Street, clean and climate-controlled. With the help of movers who asked no questions, I packed Raphael and Allison's belongings into neat rows of boxes, their furniture, their photo albums, even the children's toys, all placed carefully inside, labeled and stacked. I prepaid 3 months. It was more generosity than they had shown me at that pier, but I couldn't bring myself to abandon them entirely when the house stood empty, its echo unsettling. I sat at the kitchen table with pen and paper. The silence was so sharp I could hear the tick of my watch. My hand trembled at first, but then steadied as the words flowed. Raphael and Allison. The house you called home has been sold. It was always mine, legally and in truth, though I never wielded that fact. I cleared the mortgage with the same love that carried me through raising you alone. But love should not make one invisible. When I read your message at the port, I finally understood my place in your lives, not at the table, but outside the frame. I cannot live in that shadow any longer. Your belongings are safe in storage. The key and address are with Clara. Should you need them, do not look for me right away. I need space to rediscover who I am, beyond mother and grandmother, beyond giver and provider. I need to breathe as myself again. I folded the letter neatly, placing it in the center of the table. Beside it, I laid the deed and a copy of the sale contract. Then I closed the door behind me. The sound, final, like a seal pressed into wax. The ship returned on a humid Sunday afternoon. By evening, my phone rang 3 times, then fell silent. I left it face down on the counter. Less than an hour later, heavy footsteps pounded up my porch steps, and then came the fist on my door. When I opened it, Raphael stood there, sunburnt from the trip, fury burning under his skin. Allison hovered behind him, her lips pressed tight, eyes darting anywhere but mine. "You sold our house." His voice cracked at the edge of disbelief. "Mom, how could you do that?" "It was just one trip," I steadied my breath. "And this," I said, keeping my tone even, "was just one house." The words landed between us like stones. He blinked, as if unable to believe I'd answered with something so plain. Raphael stepped inside without asking, pacing across my small living room. "Do you know what you've done? The kids, Matthew and Julia, this is their home, their memories. You've ripped it out from under them." "Memories don't live in wood and shingles," I replied. "They live in people." And those same people stood on a deck and decided I wasn't family enough to share 1 week of their lives. Allison spoke for the first time, her voice low. "It wasn't meant like that. Ione, we just wanted space." I turned to her. "You had space, a whole house of it. And still, there was no room for me." Raphael rubbed his hands over his face, groaning. "You blindsided us. No warning. Just gone. Who does that to their own son?" I lifted the letter I'd kept a copy of, still folded in its envelope. "I gave you my words. I gave you the truth of how I've been treated. You didn't read it yet. Or maybe you refused to. But don't say there was no warning. The signs have been there for years." He stared at the envelope, chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who clung to me after nightmares, who believed my arms could fix anything. But he wasn't that boy now. "You'll regret this," he whispered finally, though it sounded less like a threat and more like a plea. "No, Raphael," I said softly. "What I regret is waiting this long to choose myself." The silence between us stretched, heavy and final. The night after Raphael stormed out, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The house was quiet, my heart oddly steady. On my laptop, I opened a travel site and typed a single word, Paris, for as long as I could remember. It had been the dream tucked in the margins of my life. I clicked book flight without hesitation, using a fraction of the money from the sale. The confirmation email felt like a doorway opening. Before leaving, I packed a single suitcase and drove north to Asheville, where my sister Miriam lived. She greeted me at her porch with open arms and a look that told me she knew more than I'd ever said out loud. "Stay as long as you need," she said, her voice warm, unhurried. Her house was quiet, tucked among the hills, the kind of place where mornings stretched slowly and the air smelled of pine. In her spare room, I found one of her old watercolor sets in the closet, half-dried tubes of paint and brushes frayed with age. I carried them to the kitchen table and set up a small canvas. At first, my hands were clumsy, as though duty had rusted the part of me that once belonged to color and line. But as the brush moved, the water bloomed into soft shapes, pale blue bleeding into green, gold dripping into shadow. The years fell away. For the first time since I could remember, I wasn't working, or giving, or fixing. I was simply creating. When I set down the brush, I realized my chest felt lighter. The canvas wasn't perfect, but neither was I, and maybe that was finally enough. Paris greeted me with rain the morning I arrived, the kind that slicked the cobblestones and turned every streetlight into a watercolor of its own. I rented a small flat in the Marais, its windows opening to a courtyard where ivy climbed the stone walls. Days found their rhythm quickly coffee at a cafe, with chairs spilling onto the street. Afternoons spent at a watercolor class in Montmartre. Evenings wandering along the Seine until the city lights blurred into stars. I was learning to see again, not just landscapes or colors, but myself. Each brushstroke felt like reclaiming a language I'd forgotten how to speak. One evening, after returning from class, I opened my email. The subject line stopped me cold. From Allison. My hands hovered before I clicked. Her words were longer than I expected. She wrote of therapy sessions, of realizing how often boundaries had been used to disguise exclusion. She admitted they had leaned on me like an endless well, never stopping to see me as a woman with her own life. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She only said she was sorry, and that she hoped I was finally living. I read it twice, then closed the laptop without replying. My chest ached, torn between relief and a dull throb of anger. A week later, Raphael arrived. He looked thinner, softer around the eyes. We sat at a cafe by the river, the clatter of cups and low hum of voices around us. "I never saw you whole," he confessed, his gaze fixed on the table. "You were just Mom, always there, always giving. I didn't let myself think you could want anything more." His voice carried shame, but also something I hadn't heard in years: humility. By the time spring folded into summer, I was ready to return. Paris had given me back a part of myself I thought long buried. But Charleston was still home, with its moss-draped oaks and tides that kept steady time. When I stepped off the plane, Raphael and the children were waiting. Allison hung back, her expression cautious but not hostile. This time, I didn't move into their home. I rented a small apartment above a bookstore on King Street, the kind of place with creaking floors and a balcony just wide enough for 2 chairs and a pot of geraniums. It was mine, every bill, every key, every choice. We met as a family a week later. I kept my voice calm, my spine straight. "I will spend time with Julia and Matthew," I told them, but on my terms. Weekends together, not as babysitter but as grandmother. No more rescues, no more checks, no more bailing out. My help will be given if I choose it, not because it's demanded. Raphael nodded, the old defensiveness gone from his eyes. Allison's hands twisted in her lap, but she whispered, "We understand." Slowly, we began to rebuild, not as before, where I bent until I disappeared, but on ground firmer and narrower. Birthdays became smaller, shared in parks and porches. Sunday afternoons were for stories and watercolor lessons with Julia. Chess games with Matthew. I learned to leave when conversations turned brittle, and they learned not to push. Respect came awkwardly at first, but it came. One morning, I drove to Folly Beach before dawn. The horizon blushed pink, the surf tumbling against my ankles. I breathed in salt air and let the waves erase the old heaviness. Love is a gift. I whispered to the sea, respect is the receipt. Without both, the purchase fails. The sun broke fully over the water, gold spilling across the waves. And for the first time in decades, I felt the balance was finally mine.